Okay, so we talked about President Roosevelt. We're going to talk about President Taft and Wilson. So Roosevelt served 2 terms, and it was tradition. Now it's law, but it was tradition that the president would step aside, not run again. But Roosevelt backed Taft, but Taft was kind of meh. I mean, Roosevelt didn't really. He backed Taft, but it turns out that he didn't really make that good of a president. Roosevelt was more energized, and Taft just didn't seem to have the energy or the will to become president. His wife, Taft's wife, really backed him becoming president. And then soon after he was elected, his wife died. So it's kind of like, well, now what? But he is the only president to become a Supreme Court judge, too, which is, interesting. So Taft was elected in 1909, but not as effective as Roosevelt. Faced a lot of problems, and the main problem was just he just wasn't that into being president. So you have the election of 1911, and what that did is it created like a sort of a spoiler candidate thing. So the Republicans backed Taft, and the Republicans didn't want Roosevelt again because he wasn't very Republican. He wouldn't play by Republican rules, and Taft would. The Democrats put up Wilson, who obviously became president. But Roosevelt ran. He ran as a third-party candidate. And this is where you get what's called being a spoiler candidate. So Taft and Roosevelt sounded an awful lot alike. So Republican voters didn't know who to vote for. And they sort of split the vote. So let's say that if you have 2 parties running against each other, the split is not 50-50, but you got, a two-way split. It could be 60-40, it could be, whatever. Let's say you're running at 60%. You have two people running. If you have 3 people running and that third person sounds like you can split that 60% vote, so 30-30, and then the person with 40 ends up the winner. So that's one of the troubles with, within our party system, third-party candidates is sometimes they spoil elections. This happened in 2000 with Bush and Gore. You had a guy named Ralph Nader, and had Ralph Nader not have run, we would have had President Gore. This also happened before that with President Bush's father, where he had Perot, and Perot sounded a lot like President Bush. If it wasn't for Perot, Bush would have won and not Clinton. So Roosevelt served as a spoiler candidate, and that basically gave the election over to Wilson. Wilson just had to sit back and watch Taft and Roosevelt go at each other, or Roosevelt go after Taft, basically. So Wilson, he creates what he calls his new freedom. Presidents like to give names to their policy, like what they plan on doing for America. Trump's is Make America Great Again. Wilson called his the New Freedom. So Wilson goes about breaking up big business even more so than Roosevelt. Throws down the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act went a lot further than the Sherman Antitrust Act, and we sort of talked about it. It just gave the whole sort of trust busting, more teeth to take a bite out of big business. Created the Federal Trade Act, or the FTC. The FTC monitored business transactions and business mergers and stuff like that. So they would, instead of waiting for business to merge and then cause problems, you had to get permission from the government to merge, and that's sort of the case today. So an end to laissez-faire, and remember laissez-faire is the government keeps their hands out of the economy. And this pretty much was the start of government, like a tipping point of government getting heavily involved in the regulation of the economy. So tariffs. one thing about tariffs is tariff is a tax on imports. So at the time, the United States had high tariffs, which protected domestic business. Now, protected businesses that really didn't need protection. So, like, let's say you have solar panels, and solar panels are being manufactured in China, and they're cheaper than solar panels being manufactured here. But you want the solar panel, your domestic solar panel industry to like really take off. You would raise tariffs on Chinese solar panels, so American businesses have a chance to get their legs under them. But if you tariff something like oil or something like that, oil has been around for 150 years. Having a tariff on oil is kind of useless because it's already an established industry. So tariffs are mainly to protect domestic businesses. So the businesses we were protecting were trying to become monopolies. So Wilson substantially lowered tariffs. Well, with lowering tariffs, you lower government income, which is problematic. So he created, not he, but Congress, and he created the 16th Amendment, which is income tax. So to make up for the loss in revenue, income is now taxed. And in the Constitution, before this, it was illegal to tax income. You can only tax trade. So like a sales tax would be constitutional, but an income tax would not be. So they had to create the 16th Amendment, and the middle class was the focus of really the income tax, because rich people they don't earn a paycheck. They make their money off their investments, and taxing poor people is just stupid. So we don't really do that. And then he created the Federal Reserve System. So if you recall from later unit, money was tied to gold, and that made money really rare. And so not a lot of people had what you call liquidity, meaning they didn't have money that they could go and spend. So the Federal Reserve System is basically the government takes out loans or sells bonds, which is a promise to pay you back. And with those bonds, they create dollar bills, and then those dollar bills are used to, for economic activity. So here's sort of a criticism of President Wilson. With this antitrust legislation, he's dumping it into a pump, business prosperity pump. The pump is supposed to, pump from the ground up, but here he is trying to get the pump he's cheating, like he's filling the business prosperity pump when it should be pumping from the ground. This is the Federal Trade Commission. We still have this today. And then little flyers about you paying income tax. It's now April 15th instead of March 15th. Federal Reserve districts. You'll touch on this more when you take economics. Women win suffrage. So suffrage is the right to vote. So the struggle for the vote, by 1912, only 5 states gave the right to vote to women. The way the Constitution is written, states individually regulate their own elections. That's why you probably hear with the midterm elections, Florida's, having a recount, and it's kind of a disaster because, their machines broke or something like that. The federal government, unless they pass laws, the states are in charge of running, federal elections and things like that. So giving women the right to vote, you'd have to amend the Constitution. It's really up to the states as to whether or not they want to give women the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt, followed by Susan B. Anthony. These were women who really pushed for women's suffrage. And their big arguments were we want to own property, we want to be able to divorce, we're sort of trapped by our husbands. And it's kind of like an equal rights thing. I mean, women have different interests than men. The political landscape changed after women won the right to vote. One big thing that happened was we banned alcohol. Now, say what you will about banning alcohol or, whatever the case may be. That didn't change. That didn't happen until, women won the right to vote. They have, different priorities. So the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. I like to remember it. In 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed and it gave women the right to vote. It was really 1920, but all the work was done in 1919. So now you have prohibition. So the 18th Amendment, which was in 1920, it takes a while. It's like they're numbered weird. Sometimes it takes a while. Like the struggle to the right to vote and get all the states on board to give women the right to vote happened first. It happened before Prohibition, but Prohibition was moved through faster, so it became 18, whereas giving women the constitutional right to vote took a little bit longer, so that became the 19th Amendment. So I remember Prohibition. How old are you when you're an adult and can't drink? 18. And then creates massive crime rates. We'll get into why crime went up. I mean, whenever you make something illegal, you create criminals. I mean, it's true of anything. If there were no laws against murder, then murderers wouldn't be criminals, right? That's not a crime. I'm not saying we should get rid of murder laws, but you can't get rid of the fact that laws create criminals. That's just kind of how it works. And the 21st Amendment, 1933, it was during the Depression. They repealed Prohibition, and really they did it. It's like, dude, we need a drink, I mean, people are suffering. Let me have a beer. And also it created jobs. It put people back to work producing alcohol. So that was a job creator. And I remember the 21st Amendment as when it gave people the right to drink, or repealed the 18th Amendment. How old are you when you're an adult and finally can drink? You're 21. So 18 is how old are you when you're an adult and can't drink? That's 18. And then, like I said, with the 21st. So that's just how I remember it. So giving women the right to vote, it was, Wilson did sort of support it, but again, the government wasn't really used to pushing the states around and telling them what to do to that extent. Here's Susan B. Anthony. The Republicans were against giving women the right to vote. A lot of it had to do with the fact that they knew that policies would change, not really in their favor. But part of the reasoning is they thought that women, because you're married, I mean, whatever interests you have are the interests your husband have. So, what's the point of having the right to vote if your interests match? Thing is, though, is interests didn't match. So you started to see, changes. Here's an anti-women's suffrage poster. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. So basically, you get these women who they just become unattractive, and they're pissed off that they're unattractive, so they become a suffragette. Life in the 1920s, changing role of women. Women were able to get more jobs, go out and work more. That's one of the reasons why they wanted the right to vote. They wanted to be able to facilitate, them working and, becoming more liberated. More women went to college. You have flappers. You may have heard the term flappers. That's what we call a liberated woman between the ages of 15 and 25 or so. And you knew somebody was a flapper. They wore heavy makeup, short hair, short skirts. They would smoke and drink in public. And, this was kind of a big deal. It was a radical change in behavior of what it meant to be a woman in the United States. So the 18th Amendment, we talked about that. Now the 18th Amendment, all it did was ban the sale and distribution of alcohol. The Volstead Act created sort of a police force, or allowed for policing to make sure that this stuff didn't happen. So again, society was really like I don't need. They really valued privacy. Like today, it's like the government can monitor your emails and stuff like that. If you could explain what an email was to someone in the 1920s, they would just absolutely just abhor the fact that the government was that involved in your life. So the Volstead Act kind of, it's like the 18th Amendment was like sale and distribution. You could be drunk in public and you could drink, but so at least you had that personal freedom. But transporting it and producing it was illegal. So speakeasies are illegal bars, and bootlegging is that transport. You keep the uh, alcohol in your the boot goes up to your ankle, and you keep the alcohol in there. They just called it bootlegging. And speakeasies, like I said, are illegal bars. This created organized crime. So here's the deal: if you make something illegal, and if your property is made illegal, if your property is made illegal, and you want to deal in this property, like let's say you have marijuana stolen from you, like a pound of marijuana. You can't go to the police and say someone stole my marijuana, my pound of marijuana, or crack. Someone stole my pound of crack. You can't go to court and say that man stole my property. So if you can't go through the legal system to protect your property, you're going to protect it yourself, but you're going to protect it with violence. And then it kind of becomes an arms race where, because there is no legal protection, people will do, theft. They'll steal your stuff or kill your guys or something like that. So it becomes this arm race of who can become more violent. And we see this with the current drug war, where we've been at war with drugs for 40 years, and it looks like drugs are winning. And this should have taught us a lesson here, but it really didn't. When you make something illegal and there's still a market for it, people still wanted to drink, well, that's going to cause a lot of violence. So life in the 1920s, they were called the lost generation. And really what it means is, society was structured a certain way. And then these people went away to war, these young people, and they found how fragile life was. And having all these rules of what you can and can't do, sort of just, they shed all of that, especially women. So they called them the lost generation, like the massive cultural change to older people are like, oh, this generation is just lost. They've deviated, and every generation does that. Your parents may think like, oh, these teenagers today, but when they were teenagers, their parents said, oh, these teenagers today. So I mean, it's every generation criticizes the next generation. They saw little reason to follow old rules. You started to see nativism. We already talked about this in our immigration unit. You had immigrants coming over, and with immigration, you see a lot of racism, really. What you call xenophobia, fear of people not like you. And KKK membership grew. Really, it's like the KKK really just kind of hated on black people and Jews. But then you have Italians coming over, anarchists, communists, blah, 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 blah. The KKK diversified. They allowed people who hated communists, who hated socialists, who hated anarchists. So through that, their membership grew. Religious fundamentalism. So Christianity kind of hit a crisis point where science was very literal, meaning, you drop a pin, that's gravity, and there's, a pretty good way to explain the phenomenon that happened. And people started trusting in science more than they trusted in, these older beliefs like Christianity. So Christianity, I mean, you have various types of Christianity. One that grew was, Christian fundamentalism, which is popular today, but it took a literal look at the Bible. Like there was literally an Adam and Eve. There was literally a Noah's Ark. There is literally a Daniel in the lion's den. So God saved Daniel from being eaten by lions. All of this stuff is literal. All of these stories are literal. And you are to read the Bible literally. Now, something that they forget is that the Bible has been translated many different times. So if you've ever gone on Google Translate, you type something in, you translate it, you translate it, you translate it, and then you translate it back to English. And what you originally plugged in English is nothing like what was spit out by Google. Things just get lost in translation. So, like in the Old Testament, the stories that are told in the Old Testament are just moral tales, like Aesop's fables, where you have anthropomorphic animals talking to each other and stuff like that. These are just moral tales. They're not like specific accounts of what happened. And this stuff kind of runs afoul in Tennessee, which became pretty fundamentalist. There was a teacher who taught scopes. He taught evolution, and he got mocked for it. People think like evolution means you came from monkeys, and that isn't really the case. You have a common ancestor. Like if you go back far enough, we all share the same great-grandfather kind of thing. And he was fined for teaching evolution, didn't pay it. He went to court and he still had to pay it, but it put the fundamentalism versus evolution conversation in the national spotlight, and it really hasn't been resolved. With Christian fundamentalists, and this is just from personal experience, many of them don't believe in climate change because in the Bible it says God created the earth and God's creation is perfect, so God's creation can't change. So they don't believe that, climate change is, many don't believe that climate change is real because of what they believe in the Bible. Or they just simply don't believe in evolution because of what the Bible tells them, the faith that they have. And then radio and movies became more popular. You have a lot of radio shows. Some of them are still pretty funny. I have them on cassette tape, though. I need to get them into a computer file or something like that. In movies, they were black and white. We didn't really have talkies yet, so it was just like they'd put up you'd have a scene and then they'd put up a title card explaining what was going on. During this time, you had a movie by D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, and from a film standpoint, it was really influential because of, he just did different camera work. You had cut scenes. Had all this different stuff, but at the same time, racists latched onto it, and it sort of fueled nativism in the KKK. When D.W. Griffith, he wasn't trying to be racist, he was just trying to tell a story, and racists latched onto it and thought, hey, this is a white pride movie, when that wasn't Griffith's intention at all. So here's how, women dressed. You have, the hats, the short hair. You can kind of see makeup, the short skirts. You'd at the knee, almost there. You'd try to cover the knee. You wouldn't go over the knee. High heels and stuff. You could see bare feet. They had long sleeves, but you'd also have short sleeves where you show wrist and arm. So here's what a flapper would look like with the long pearls, the heavy makeup, the short hair, the gloves. This is really short because she's a performer, really. And then I guess these people were brave enough to take a picture of themselves at a speakeasy holding up drinks. And he started to have art produced by women that celebrated womanhood, really, and you can kind of clue into what the artist is going for here. And she put that out, and it was pretty controversial, but it was accepted by many as forward thinking. We have a lot of hangups on sex and stuff like that, but there's always stuff out there to challenge our notions of how society's norms should be. So here's a wheel cover, repeal the 18th Amendment. Here they are. They caught a distillery, making alcohol, and they're getting rid of it. Same thing here. They're getting rid of the alcohol. Yeah, the cops, and all that stuff. Here's Al Capone, one of the more famous gangsters who sort of controlled the underground, the black market of alcohol. And he used violence. Here's a picture from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where he killed his competition, basically. And if you go to Alcatraz, Al Capone was housed there. So I like this right here, the prohibition flowchart. So public thinks X is scary. Authorities ban X to make the public feel safe. No legal way to obtain X. Value from X increases. A black market forms. Organized crime gains a new source of income. Organized crime grows. So the frequency of violent crime increases. Law enforcement uses harsher tactics. Criminals become more violent. Then it just kind of spirals in circles to where, you have, SWAT teams raiding houses and stuff like that. I mean, I don't think as a society we've ever meant for it to come to that. But I guess as a society we feel it is necessary because, well, that is what's going on. So the Harlem Renaissance, what is it? It's a growth of African American culture, paintings, music, dance, literature. It integrated black and white cultures. So segregation was the law of the land. And what's ironic is in speakeasies were desegregated. Because really, if you're black and you're paying for alcohol, what do they care where they get their money from? So it's, business is business. You have the Great Migration and basically the exodus or a mass migration from the South. And it was just black people seeking opportunity. And they did. I mean, they encountered racism in both places, but in the South, whistling at a white woman would get you horribly murdered. So essentially, this is why you have large African American populations in Oakland. This is in the 1920s, so you're talking people's grandparents, great grandparents. It's fairly recent. And usually just all the industrial cities where they found jobs. Detroit, when automobiles really took off in the 50s, you had a lot of black people working factory floors. Here's Harlem itself, so the island of Manhattan, and here's Harlem. So they sort of segregated themselves, but white people would go into Harlem and find entertainment there, which is kind of sad when you think about it. You may hear something about cultural appropriation, and we'll discuss it in class. But I mean, to white people, black people had always had entertainment value, but they didn't have value as U.S. citizens. So, black people were the entertainment, but as soon as black people wanted rights, white people were like, no, 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 no. But at the same time, you can take our culture and adopt it, but we're not allowed to fully join society like you're enjoying it. So we'll go over this in class, this too. And then here's some performers. Here's Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. Political changes, good times. Politically, it was pretty stable. He didn't have a lot of upheaval and stuff like that. And after World War I, Wilson ended World War I. So World War I ended on Wilson, and people just wanted political normalcy, and the Republicans gave that to him. You had Harding, who just kind of, there's nothing really significant about the Harding administration. One thing that came out of it was the Teapot Dome scandal, where one of his cabinet members was straight up paid off by an oil company to allow that oil company to drill on federal land. So here's a briefcase of $50,000. Okay, yeah, you can go do this. You're not supposed to take bribes like that. And that was just about the only major thing to happen. Coolidge, Coolidge came up with what you call supply side economics, or he didn't come up with it, but his administration is sort of marked by that. And really, what it is a lot of pro-business government policies like raising tariffs or cutting corporate taxes, things like that. Tax the middle class. So majority of the taxes paid came from the middle class because they were a pretty strong majority. Isolationism, we're not going to screw with Europe, whatever's going on in Europe, we're not going to pay attention to it. Let's pay attention to what's going on in America. We outlawed war with the Kellogg Brand Pact. Okay, I mean, can't really outlaw war, but I guess we did. And then Hoover, the Great Depression happened under Hoover because we sort of ignored what was going on at the time economically. And we'll talk about why that happens in another unit. But Hoover ended his administration in the worst part of the Great Depression. His big scandal was the bonus army. Some former World War I veterans were promised a bonus, but they wanted it early, so they marched on Washington, and Hoover sent in the army to break it up, and it turned violent, and people were really turned off by the fact that veterans were being cracked over the skull with batons and stuff, and being shot at and gassed. Economic changes, new ways of living. The end of World War I created tremendous prosperity. Unemployment was really low. People could buy goods and stuff like that, like vacuum cleaners and wall-to-wall carpets and washing machines. Automobiles started to become really popular. They were affordable for the middle class. AC current, so you can plug stuff in the wall, use vacuum plugs in the wall, washing machine plugs in the wall. So you have all these electronic devices. Advertising, and I have some examples of advertising. They're kind of hilarious. Advertising kind of creates like a demand. So, hey, if you want to be, part of the cool kids or something like that, buy our products. It really, there's really a lot of pressure on young ladies to dress up a certain way. And in the 1920s, this is where that pressure sort of started, because the only pressure that young ladies had before the 1920s to dress a certain way was to just kind of dress like your parents did, to dress really conservatively. But it's sort of weird. On the one hand, girls are allowed to dress how they want, express themselves, but then on the other hand, if they express themselves outside of certain norms, they get kind of ridiculed for it. So makeup is one of those kind of norms that girls have to use. Like by a certain age, they need to wear makeup. And I don't know, it's kind of a, like that's why you have MAC and Maybelline. And I mean, there's huge industries devoted to face paint, basically. Installment plans, people didn't have outright cash to pay for a washing machine. So a business would lend them credit. So basically, you can take the washing machine, but you owe me, $5 a week or something like that. And then once you pay off the washing machine, it's completely yours. But credit was used too much. You overextend credit. What happens when a lot of people can't pay you back? Well, then you can't pay your bills, and then you go out of business. So that's kind of a preview of what's to come. So here's Maybelline is like old. Take these 3 easy steps to instant loveliness. And I mean, who decided what was and was not lovely? I mean, you can kind of even see it in middle school. There's someone who comes to school with makeup on, and that becomes really attractive. And then all kinds of other girls start wearing makeup, and then it becomes the standard that girls wear makeup. And why? What started that standard? What makes that a a signal of being attractive. It kind of goes back to animals, like when female monkeys, when it's breeding time, they'll show their butts and they turn red. So changing colors indicates that you're ready for reproduction, at least in the animal kingdom. So sexiness and loveliness, sort of, they couldn't say, paint your face and show off to your man that you're ready to get down. That's a little too much for society. So they had to kind of like talk around it and stuff like that. So it's weird that, I don't know, I kind of find it weird that like painting your face is a symbol of attraction and stuff like that. But we just take it as gospel, and it's part of our society and it's a norm. A typewriter, ooh, yeah. This would be like like a computer advertisement or something like that. You can type letters now instead of handwriting them. Here's a radio. You can get a radio. It's kind of like its own appliance, its own radio cabinet you'd have, kind of like a TV. Here's a washing machine. Model T, you've probably seen pictures of that. Fat men wash away fat and years of age with soap. So if you use soap, it'll make you less fat. Right. And that's back when companies could claim whatever they wanted. Physicians say Luckies are less irritating. It's toasted. Lucky Strike. This is a little bit later, but people knew that like cigarettes weren't healthy. They even knew that like using tobacco was unhealthy. Years, like 400 years ago when tobacco use kind of ramped up. It's it's kind of weird that doctors are like, well, if you're going to be addicted, these cigarettes are what you should be addicted to. Yeah, it's just kind of weird. All right, so that pretty much ends it.